Great. So today I am here to talk to you about the book and the Gospel of John. So who is the author then? That's a good place to start, isn't it? Well, who wrote this Gospel? The author is referred to actually a few times throughout this book as the disciple that Jesus loved. You've probably recognized that phrase if you've read some of the New Testament. We know that it's definitely one of two Johns. There is a little bit of debate. It could be John the son of Zebedee, or a John who was known a little bit later as John the Elder of the later church. But most people think it was John the son of Zebedee. So what's the point of this book then? Let's get into the meat of this. What's the purpose? Well, just like Matthew, Mark and Luke, the Gospel of John does overlap with some of its stories of Jesus, but with a very specific emphasis. I don't know if you've noticed, but each of our Gospels that we've looked at set out to demonstrate a different thing about Jesus. Well, John makes it clear what his intentions are for his writing. And you can see this if you flick to John 20 verse 31, because he sets it out very clearly. He said, "But these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." His mission was to help the reader understand that Jesus was the Messiah that was prophesied about in the Old Testament, and that he really was the Son of God. It's the purpose of this book, as it's just said, is to help the reader come to a place of faith and belief in this man called Jesus, and as John says, so that we may have life in his name. So there's a lot going on in this book, in the Gospel of John, and one thing I want to say before we take a look at the main overview is this. Everything in this book is extremely deliberate. Yes, it's a story of Jesus' ministry, but it is told in a very particular way. It's told with a structure that would help the readers of the time understand better who Jesus was and is. Unlike the Gospels of Mark and Luke that show parts of Jesus' humanity, John wants to emphasize that Jesus was God. And we can see this right at the beginning of John's Gospel, because he starts with John 1:1, in the beginning, which is obviously a callback to Genesis 1. It says this in these first couple of verses: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind." And if we skip down to verse 14 in that same chapter, it says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us." He's trying to convince the people that this Jesus was in fact God. He was there at the beginning of the universe, and he came to earth as a man. John continues to try and convince people of Jesus' deity with the number 7. And that sounds a bit weird right now, but I'll explain in a minute. He loves the number 7. What I'm not going to do today is walk through chapter by chapter and tell you what happens in each section in our summary, except all I'm going to say is that the book of John is an account of Jesus' ministry and his death and resurrection. And like I said, John tells that story through sevens, if that makes sense. For example, in chapter 1, John is telling the story of John the Baptist, where Jesus is given 7 titles by people who were trying to figure out who he was. Titles like the Son of God and Lamb of God. And through John's telling of Jesus' ministry, 7 times Jesus says the phrase, "I am," followed by something different. Like, for example, "I am the bread of life," or "I am the light of the world." All of those phrases correspond to the lesson that Jesus is teaching, or the situation that's going on around Jesus and his disciples. Now, of course, in that moment, Jesus is telling us something specific about himself, but also note the use of the phrase, "I am." Because if you don't know what that is, it's the Old Covenant name that God shared with Moses in the Old Testament. This, of course, isn't a mistake, but it's very, very deliberate by John. There are also 7 separate instances in this gospel where Jesus just says the phrase, I am, which really angered people at the time, because what he was saying was that I am God. One of those times was when the Romans were looking for him in the garden just before his trial and crucifixion. They asked who Jesus was, and he simply said, I am. The other use of 7 in this gospel is the 7 signs. Now, these signs were miracles, stories about Jesus' ministry, and there are a few ways that people like to look at these signs and what scholars have decided upon. Firstly, that they are fulfilled prophecies of the Old Testament about the coming of the Messiah. And of course, as any sign is supposed to do, it points to something. It points to Jesus being the Messiah, the one that they were waiting for. John wanted to make sure the readers understood that Jesus was this Messiah by showing these signs. The other way that people see this and the miracles that Jesus did, they harked back to the miracles done in the Old Testament. And what scholars believe is that John is showing that Jesus is higher than the prophets of old, or he is the same as God. He basically shows that Jesus can do the same miracles they did, but with a higher power. Like when Elijah and Elisha healed a son, they had to touch him. But Jesus in this sign, he didn't have to do that. He stood at a distance. Or when Moses divided the waters through God's power, Jesus simply walked on top of them. And I'll end the examples with one of my favourites. Jesus heals a blind man, which is one of the 7 signs as well. And I'm going to read this verse to you, which is 9, 5-7. It says this, while I am in the world, I am the light of the world, which, by the way, is one of the 7 I ams. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. So the man went and washed, and he came home seeing. I don't know if you noticed that moment in there. It's a moment that a lot of scholars and teachers agree is actually supposed to be a parallel of God making man from the earth. When you take this back to the original Greek, what we have here actually is Jesus creating life. Because we read it in our English as he put the mud on the man's eyes, but what it is in the Greek, it's translated better really as Jesus put it in the man's eye sockets, meaning there wasn't anything there before, but there was afterwards. And all of a sudden, instead of this being a miracle that any prophet could do through the power of God, we actually have God face to face with his own creation in that moment. And John emphasizes the divinity of Jesus by showing that Jesus did more than heal an eye, but he actually made them. And the readers, we are reminded of John's opening statements, aren't we, again, at the start of this gospel in the poem, that through him, through Jesus, through the Word, everything was created. It all points to Jesus being more than a man, the Messiah and the God of heaven and earth. And John is desperate for people to understand who he is and what he has done. Which brings me on to my key verse tonight. One of the most quoted, famous, memorized verses in the whole Bible, for me, just sums up everything that John is trying to say in this gospel, his whole purpose for writing it. And maybe as I read this verse, my prayer to you is that it will come to you tonight with a fresh meaning and maybe a new impact. Are you ready? John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, and that whoever believes in him should not die or perish, whichever version you have, but will have everlasting life. How could I talk about the book of John and not talk about this verse? If you don't know what's happening around this verse, this is Jesus speaking to a man called Nicodemus. someone who was a Pharisee and a teacher, someone high up who should have really understood what Jesus was saying, but he was having some difficulty understanding. Jesus goes on to try and explain to him. He talks about faith. He tells him that we shouldn't hide in darkness and shame, but come into the light of the world. Step into the light that has come into the world, that is Jesus. Well, so what? Well, our challenge from this verse is for all of us. For those who have not yet given our lives to God, it's a message of hope, a message of love and an invitation to believe, but also a reminder for us who maybe already believe that we have a loving God who loves us right here, right now. What an incredible thing he did for us, what an awesome thing it was, and we need to remind ourselves often with this verse and lots of other verses as well from the Bible, but we have to remind ourselves that whatever we're going through, whatever's happening in our lives, we are loved by God, our Father. He loves this world, which means that he loves you. And that is the book of John.